I'm here in the studio with a face you might recognize. Maybe you've seen him a couple times, Tim Murphy, and he's actually my guest today. Instead of interviewing someone, I'm interviewing you.
Isn't that kind of cool?
Yeah.
The tables have turned.
They sure
And so have the chairs.
Thank God for those spinny chairs.
I know, right?
So, Tim, we're here
Riley.
to talk about Fringe. You are doing a show for the Fringe Festival.
My second time for the Fringe.
Your second time doing a show for Fringe.
Yeah.
And it's My Life is Not a Drag.
My life is not a drag.
Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Sure. I started doing Joan Rivers, an impersonation of Joan Rivers in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in a musical review, I think it was something around 88, probably.
Okay.
And it sort of took off, the impersonation sort of took on a life of its own, and it led to a career for me of sorts, working with a show called An Evening at La Cage that I started with in the 90s. And I worked for 5 years doing La Cage. And in the process, though, I sort of abandoned my musical theater career because the work was there and it was really good money.
Right.
And, but there was a lot of baggage that came along with doing Joan and doing drag for a living. Mostly because it was not what I set out to do.
Right.
And it was hard for me to actually accept that this was something that that people liked, that I was good at it, and that it was a career. Like I never really was satisfied with it being my career. And there were a lot of other issues too, like just mental stuff, like a lot of baggage that I carried around, the stigma, the internalized homophobia. There was a whole bunch of stuff going on inside of me that made it really difficult for me to embrace the drag.
Right.
And so it took a long time for me to actually get to the point where I could be proud of the work that I did, be proud of the talents that I had developed, and see it as a real art form, I guess.
Yeah.
And so this show is sort of the progression of my life, of how I came to terms with a lot of things, including being a drag queen.
And what are some of the, because we talked a little bit before about how you always saw doing Joan Rivers as a temporary thing and never something that you could fully embrace. But now, I mean, it's become a huge part of your identity and your career.
I think probably my Joan Rivers
pivotal.
impersonation is probably the thing I'm most known for now,
Yeah.
as far as a performer goes.
So tell me a little bit about that progression.
Well, you got to understand that, first of all, it starts with being gay. I mean, and growing up in a time in the 1970s when there weren't homosexuality, when I was a teenager, was still deemed a mental illness.
Right.
The messages I got from a variety of places, from society, certainly from organized religion, and even in my own family, there was a taboo about homosexuality. And I went to an all-boys Catholic high school, and it wasn't anything that was discussed.
Right.
And I didn't know anybody else who was gay growing up. So I had a real identity problem with being gay. I had a real issue with having any kind of pride in who I was or how I felt. So right away, right off the hop, I'm working with my own internalized stigmas. Then when I could do the voices and stuff, my voices came along before the drag came along. I never really did drag. But, you know, looking back on it, and one of the things I discuss in the show is that I did like to dress up in my sister's clothes. My mother had a black negligee. I used to put on the negligee and pretend I was Endora from Bewitched and make all, you know, but I knew somehow that it wasn't normal. It wasn't right, you know, like there was even shame. I wouldn't put on my mother's negligee when anybody was home.
Right.
This was something I would do, dress up and play, but I would never walk around in women's clothing or my sister's shoes when anybody else was around. So obviously, I knew enough at that age, even though I was maybe only 10 years old, that this was not acceptable.
Not normal.
Right. So can you imagine then you take this and you add gay and then dressing like a woman, you put it all together. There's no way that I could ever do that in my lifetime and be proud of it, the way that I grew up and what was in my brain. So when the opportunity arose, after having doing Joan that one time in Winnipeg, and then it sort of ballooning, doing a performance in Toronto, getting discovered in Toronto by the show La Cage, and then headlining with that show for 5 years, and having to call my family and my father and explain that I was going to do this job. Now, and I'd never even come out to my parents. Can you imagine? Now I'm like 28 years old, and not only have I not said that I'm gay, but now I'm calling home to say, I got this offer for a job, but I have to dress as a woman, as Joan Rivers, and blah, 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 and, you know, and do the show.
And by the way.
Yeah, and so the reaction was, from my father, was, well, that's not what you set out to do. Like you wanted to be a singer and an actor and a dancer. What is this business? Like, what is that about? And I was like, well, the money is so good. And he said, well, that's how prostitutes get started.
And then now you have this in your head.
So now suddenly I'm a hooker, right? So everything was negative about the drag. And that sat with me. And no matter, you can stand on stage and have 250 people clapping for you and get reviews saying that you're great, but if you don't believe it yourself, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good. So I had all this garbage inside of me, and eventually it took its toll on me, and I ended up turning to substances. I was unhappy in my life. I didn't like myself. I didn't think I was worthy of love or affection. I believed all of those terrible things that I'd heard growing up about being gay as being dirty and wrong, and then the drag aspect of it being not a real art. Yeah. So anyway, after a number of years in and out of addiction, not in and out, always an addict, but in and out of recovery, I guess, and using and abusing, finally I got to a point in my life after I'd done enough work where I could actually celebrate who I was in every aspect of my life. And then sorry to interrupt, but once I did that, once I got to that place, it's kind of like I aligned myself with the universe, where suddenly I just accepted, and with that acceptance came this moment, and things just started presenting themselves to me. Opportunities changed, my life changed really because I changed the way I thought about myself.
And that brought you to the show, which highlights the transformation, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it right after this break.
Okay.